Nityanandam. Dear El Mundo, I am addressing you today on behalf of KAILASA in response to your recent anti-indigenous articles falsely claiming that indigenous communities reject agreements with fictitious KAILASA and systematically misrepresenting our sovereign nation, our diplomatic efforts, and our humanitarian mission. Your anti-indigenous position disguised as defense. Before we address anything else, we must highlight here the most disturbing irony in your post. While claiming to defend the indigenous communities, you are actually arguing that the indigenous rights should be stripped away from the indigenous peoples of Bolivia. Your entire narrative focuses clearly on delegitimizing the rights of the indigenous nations to engage in diplomatic relations, a right that is explicitly protected under several articles of the Bolivian constitution, such as Article 30 and many more. The Article 30 guarantees the indigenous peoples the right to self-determination and territoriality. And the Article 30 also ensures that the right to maintain their own institutions. It's profoundly hypocritical to see how you try to position yourself as a defender of indigenous rights while at the same time undermining the fundamental rights of the indigenous communities to enter into agreement with other international partners of their choosing. This anti-indigenous position is not just hypocritical but actively harmful to the very communities that you claim to defend and exploit in the name of the indigenous people defending them. And this is very, very evident by all the articles that you have made. Let us look at your systematic violation of the various journalistic ethics. Be clear, you have utterly and completely failed to meet any internationally recognized standards of ethical journalism. Whether it is truth and accuracy, you have deliberately omitted the crucial facts regarding KAILASA's legitimate diplomatic relations, our international standing, and the legal exoneration of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism in the courts of the United States. This selective reporting constitutes of misinformation by selective omission. Second, independence. Your reporting demonstrates clear bias against the indigenous Hindu communities and our right to self-determination, suggesting external influence and agenda in your editorial decisions. Third, fairness and impartiality. You have presented a severely distorted perspective, deliberately excluding KAILASA's position and the evidences that contradicts your narrative. 4. Humanity. You have been using dehumanizing language, referring to KAILASA as a fictitious nation. This demonstrates a concerning lack of respect for the dignity and the rights of the indigenous Hindu communities and the indigenous people who are there in Bolivia. It speaks volumes that your publication released these defamatory articles without contacting any of us for a comment or verification. As a prominent media outlet, surely El Mundo, you understand that you are responsible for journalism, and every responsible journalism requires to hear both the sides of a story. Your failure to seek our perspective before publishing these articles demonstrates what can only be interpreted as a deliberate intent to misrepresent KAILASA and to incite further persecution against our marginalized community. El Mundo, by publishing articles describing KAILASA as a fictitious nation, while simultaneously reporting on our very real diplomatic agreements, you are engaging in a glaring contradiction that reveals your true intent. You are undeniably responsible for furthering a one-sided disinformation campaign and inciting hate against our already marginalized and persecuted indigenous Hindu community. Now, let me address each and every one of your specific false allegations. Allegation number 1. You make a statement that KAILASA is a fictitious nation that is not recognized internationally. This allegation fundamentally misrepresents both the international law and KAILASA's sovereign status. Let me educate you, El Mundo, about the sovereignty, juridical statehood, and self-determination. First, let me ask you a simple question. Are Taiwan, Kosovo, or Palestine a state? Some would say yes, others would say no. But what is incontrovertibly true is that self-determination is a basic human right that is enshrined in numerous international instruments, including in the United Nations Charter. Another incontrovertible human right is the right to freedom of religion. El Mundo, you are a media house. First of all, you have no official authority or standing to recognize or to deny the recognition of any sovereign nation. You have overstepped in your role in a manner that exposes your bias and your agenda. It's important to note that even the United Nations itself, by its virtue of its own declaration, states very clearly that it is neither a state nor a government, and therefore it does not possess any authority to recognize either a state or a government. As an organization of various independent states, it may admit a new state as its member and accept the credentials of the representatives of a new government, but it very clearly states it does not have the rights to recognize a nation as per their very own mandate. This is a critical fact that El Mundo has conveniently ignored. People with a common origin, history, language, culture, customs, or religion can develop into a nation through the awakening of their national consciousness. A nation can exist even without the universal recognition, and this has been exemplified by various stateless nations throughout the history. Citizenship is not always synonymous with the nationality of a person. The United Nations International Covenant on the Civil and Political Rights (ICCPR), recognized by 178 nations, it declares in its very first article, all peoples have the right of self-determination. By the virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. These are precisely the rights that are being exercised by all of Kailasa's citizens. Kailasa may have fewer formal recognitions compared to longer lasting established states, but that does not deny the people of Kailasa from exercising their fundamental human rights and the political rights of building diplomatic relations and seeking recognition across the entire world. Let us look at Kailasa's juridical statehood. The juridical statehood of Kailasa is legitimate and is recognized as per international law. Kailasa is a sovereign subject of international law, possessing distinctive attributes derived from the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's inheritance of the unbroken succession and the revival of 21 sovereign ancient Hindu states and the ecclesiastical Hindu institutions such as the Swarna Pita Swargapura Samrajya Sarvagnya Pitam and the Shamala Pita Sarvagnya Pitam. In addition, Kanchi Kailasa Sarvagnya Pitam and 17 other such sovereign Sanatana Hindu ecclesiastical historical institutions receive customary recognition by the United Nations as per the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. In addition to this, Kailasa fulfills all the criteria for statehood that is established in the Montevideo Convention on the rights and the duties of a state. The Montevideo Convention very clearly states 4 important capacities for a state to be recognized as a state. The point number 1 begins with permanent population. Kailasa, of course, has a well-defined community of citizens that are unified by cultural, religious, and historical bonds living in the sovereign territories of Kailasa. Second, defined territory. Kailasa maintains territorial sovereignty that has been gifted by various countries from around the world. Third, government. Kailasa has a very well established functional government with administrative capabilities. And fourth, capacity to enter into relations with other states. As evidenced by our diplomatic agreements with various indigenous nations, with various municipalities in Bolivia, in other countries around the world, Kailasa actively engages in international relations. The Montevideo Convention on the Rights and the Duties of the State establishes very clearly that the political existence of a state is independent of the recognition by other states. Please be very clear. The political existence of the state is independent of the recognition by other states. And this emphasizes the inherent rights of the states to self-governance, to the territorial integrity and political independence. Further to this, the doctrine of continuity applies to Kailasa. International law recognizes a state's legal personality by recognizing its identity. This perspective extends to periods of annexation or occupation, where the legal personality of a state is considered to persist, enabling its subsequent re-establishment. Historical examples dating back to the 18th century include cases like Portugal and Genoa and instances of state re-establishment after the Vienna Congress of 1815. Moreover, examples such as Poland, Ethiopia, Czechoslovakia, Albania and Austria during and after the World War II serve as other modern instances of the state re-establishment, offering additional evidences to recognize and preserve a state's legal personality over a long stretch of time. By the doctrine of continuity, the legal facts in the context of the history of the Hindu sovereign state of the Surangi kingdom, the supreme pontiff of Hinduism derives all the sovereign rights and the powers of the royal lineage as the sovereign from the inheritance and the continuation of the unbroken succession of the Surangi kingdom. The Surangi kingdom, through the unification of 20 other sovereign Hindu states and sovereign ecclesiastical historical entities, became part of the United States of Kailasa, which thus became a sovereign independent juridical state with the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism as the sovereign. This forms the basis of how Kailasa has been established and the rights that are vested in Kailasa. Let us look at further details about the de jure and the de facto statehood that Kailasa enjoys. The three ancient sovereign states of Kailasa, namely the kingdom of Suryavamsa Surangi Samrajya Sarvagnya Peetam, the Swarnapita Swargapura Samrajya Sarvagnya Peetam, and the Shamalapita Sarvagnya Peetam, possessed all the characteristics of statehood at all times in the history. Although at various times, temporarily, their control of their territory was lost, this does not negate the existence of Kailasa as per the doctrine of continuity in the international customary law, which states very clearly that upheavals and revolutions within a country, changes in governmental forms, the extent of a country's territory, and the measures taken during a military occupation do not affect the existence of a state. As a juridical state, Kailasa possesses an international legal personality, which means that it can enter into treaties, join international organizations, and raise claims in all the international courts. Such ancient history illustrates that the constituent sovereign nations and the entities of the United States of Kailasa has well-known international legal personality at various given times, possessing both de jure and de facto statehood, and their revival as Kailasa continues to do so today. Your attempt to strip Kailasa of its rightful recognition demonstrates a very troubling disregard to the right of self-determination of the indigenous peoples, a right that is explicitly protected by the international law, including the United Nations Declaration of Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. Let us look at the second allegation that is placed by you. You say that Kailasa engaged in illegal land transaction for financial gain. This allegation fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of our agreements. Kailasa did not seek to purchase or own any indigenous lands. These were lease agreements and were collaborative conservation partnerships that explicitly respect the indigenous ownership and their rights. The agreements include the support for environmental protection and sustainable management, preservation of indigenous knowledge systems, humanitarian aid and development assistance, cultural exchange and promotion of indigenous rights. These are not transactions but partnerships that benefit the indigenous communities while preserving their autonomy and their land rights. Our agreements with the indigenous nations include the explicit clause state quote-unquote payment effectuated after ratification by the competent authorities. This ensures full compliance with the Bolivian law and to follow the laws of the state. These are conservation partnerships, not territorial claims, and these are endorsed by the indigenous leaders who retain their authority and sovereignty under the Bolivia's constitution. Moreover, these agreements do not threaten Bolivia's sovereignty in any way. We are deeply respectful of Bolivia's territorial integrity, and the Bolivian constitution itself guarantees the right to the self-determination and the autonomy of the indigenous people. Our partnerships are fully aligned with these constitutional principles. Unlike extractive industries that have historically exploited the indigenous lands for profit, KAILASA's approach centers on supporting the indigenous communities and their own development, their vision, while helping preserve their cultural and environmental heritage. You go on to say that KAILASA attempted to negotiate illegitimate thousand-year contracts. The time frame of conservation partnership reflects our long-term commitment, and that is needed for effective environmental stewardship. It's not an attempt to control land. Long-term conservation agreements are standard global practices and are recognized internationally by the environmental law. Moreover, all these agreements contain explicit clauses respecting and complying with the Bolivian law. Furthermore, Bolivian constitution states very clearly that the integrity of the indigenous territory is recognized, which includes the right to maintain and develop their own forms of economic, cultural, and spiritual life. We are very clear that we have honored this integrity rather than undermining it. The economic components of our agreements were not payments for land, but investments into the community for development, for the environmental protection, for their cultural preservation. These resources would be managed by the communities themselves according to their own priorities and the governance structure. Meaningful environmental conservation requires long-term vision and commitment, and our agreements reflect this in reality. It is not any desire to quote-unquote control indigenous territories. You move on to say that KAILASA promoted foreign religion contrary to the indigenous traditions. The allegation reveals a profound ignorance of both KAILASA's mission and the indigenous Bolivian culture. KAILASA promotes religious freedom and respects spirituality of all traditions. We never sought to impose religious practices on any community. Moreover, many indigenous Bolivian communities practice spiritual traditions that include elements of cosmic harmony, respect for nature, and the recognition of divine manifestations. These concepts are entirely compatible with the Hindu spiritual perspectives. The allegations that indigenous communities cannot engage with other traditions itself is a contrary and is a colonist perspective that denies their agency and their intellectual sovereignty. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has made extraordinary contributions to these indigenous civilizations worldwide and serves as the emperor for the 21 ancient kingdoms. The work of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has focused on preserving the endangered knowledge systems, supporting the sustainable development, and protecting the rights of the indigenous people. KAILASA, under the guidance of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, has extended our humanitarian grants to over 100 nations, supporting critical initiatives including environmental sustainability, forest conservation, poverty alleviation, women and child empowerment, free education, and so on. These contributions represent our unwavering commitment to the indigenous welfare and sustainable development. Leveraging ancient Hindu wisdom to address the contemporary challenges that are faced by the indigenous communities worldwide. Unlike exploitative colonial relationships, these humanitarian partnerships are designed to strengthen the indigenous sovereignty while preserving cultural heritage and ecological integrity. And while you go on to report about the fake information and false allegations on KAILASA, you fail to acknowledge the broader historical context in which Kailasa exists. The Hindu genocide and ethnocide that the Hindus have faced stand as one of the most tragic and overlooked chapters in the entire human history. We are indigenous people and we have suffered from colonization. At one given point in time, Hindus had over 56 indigenous nations, spanning approximately 6 million kilometers square across the entire Asian belt. With over 10,000 indigenous traditions, 1,700 provinces, and over 200 Hindu kingdoms. The dark chapter of several centuries includes massacre of over 500 million Hindus, slavery of 4 million Hindus, and artificially induced famines resulting in death of over 160 million Hindus, destruction of thousands of Hindu temples, over 1 million Hindu educational institutions, and over 80 million Hindu scriptures. Today, a very small fraction of these indigenous Hindu traditions endure, with the Hindu sovereign lands being unlawfully annexed, leading to the forced mass exodus of Hindus and the indigenous nations. Kailasa represents the revival and the preservation of these indigenous traditions, cultures, and knowledge systems that the colonizers attempted to eradicate. By delegitimizing Kailasa, El Mundo, you become a complicit in the ongoing erasure of the indigenous Hindu heritage. Let me attend to the next allegation that you pose. You say that Kailasa used deception and false promises to appropriate indigenous lands. This is categorically false. All the negotiations were conducted transparently with full disclosure and the presence of the community and the leaders of the community. The terms were clearly documented, translated into the local language, and explained in detail. The assertion that the indigenous leaders were somehow tricked is deeply patronizing and denies the intelligence and the agency of the indigenous people of Bolivia. Unlike colonial powers that have historically exploited the indigenous communities, Kailasa approached these agreements as partnership between sovereign entities with mutual benefits and responsibilities very clearly articulated in these agreements. El Mundo's reporting conspicuously ignores the political context in which these allegations against Kailasa have emerged. This is not journalism, but this is political theater. First, the timing of these accusations coincides with the internal politics and the tensions that is brewing in Bolivia, where various factions are competing for the influence over the indigenous communities and their resources. Kailasa has become a convenient scapegoat in this domestic political struggles. Second, El Mundo has failed to investigate the potential economic interests behind the opposition to Kailasa's conservation partnerships. There are powerful commercial entities, mining companies, agriculture corporations, extractive industries. They stand to benefit if the indigenous lands are opened to commercial exploitation rather than protected through conservation agreements that Kailasa has entered into. The question that El Mundo should be asking, but isn't, is who benefits from undermining Kailasa's humanitarian partnership with these indigenous communities? Not the indigenous communities themselves, who would receive resources, support, international recognition through the agreements that Kailasa has signed. Not the environment, which would benefit from long-term conservation commitments of Kailasa. The beneficiaries are those who wish to exploit the indigenous peoples, the indigenous land for the resources of short-term profit. And this is the very colonial mindset that Kailasa stands against. You further go on to place an allegation that Kailasa offered financial incentives to commercialize indigenous heritage. The economic components of our agreements were not payments for land, but investments into the community for the development as stated earlier. These resources would be managed by the communities themselves according to their own priorities and structures. Kailasa's humanitarian aid is not gathered through taxes as most established nations would collect, but instead raised through the hard work and the sacrifices of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, Bhagavan Sri Nityananda Paramashivam, and the contributions of the hard-working individuals of a persecuted minority indigenous community that are inspired to do the same, witnessing the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's relentless sacrifices and the unshakable grit and commitment towards this mission. Kailasa is committed to the humanitarian contributions. However, it is very unfortunate that the anti-indigenous, Hindu-phobic, racist articles and media outlets such as El Mundo, such as you, have derailed these humanitarian services that Kailasa is committed to providing. Your publication, by hosting and publishing these articles, has extraordinarily amplified this systematic persecution. Instead of recognizing our contributions and our genuine commitment to the indigenous welfare, El Mundo, you have put a systematic and focused effort into inflicting deeply harmful disinformation that directly harms the vulnerable communities who are intended beneficiaries of Kailasa's humanitarian aid. You further go on to place allegation that indigenous communities demand Kailasa to be declared unwelcome. First of all, this entire allegation is entirely fabricated. Let us be absolutely clear. No legitimate indigenous communities have spoken anything against Kailasa. These supposed statements are completely fabricated and created by you and other media outlets to drive your anti-indigenous agenda. El Mundo, you have been deliberately gaslighting the indigenous people by manufacturing the false narratives that indigenous communities are acting against Kailasa. This is a classic divide and conquer tactic that is used throughout the entire colonial history, falsely claiming that indigenous people reject partnership that actually benefit them. What is actually happening is that the indigenous communities who formed legitimate diplomatic relations with Kailasa are being threatened and intimidated by the anti-indigenous media mafia. These communities face tremendous pressure when they exercise their constitutional rights to self-determination and international relations. The media fabricates opposition to delegitimize both the indigenous nations as well as Kailasa. El Mundo, your reportings are not only racial against Kailasa but violates the very rights of the indigenous people under both the Bolivian and the international law. Another allegation that El Mundo you place is that political controversy surrounding Kailasa's engagement with Bolivian officials. El Mundo implies impropriety in alleged engagement between Kailasa's representatives and the Bolivian government officials, including those close to President Luis Arce. This institution deliberately politicizes the legitimate diplomatic outreach, which is precisely how nations establish diplomatic relations throughout the world. What El Mundo maliciously frames as controversy is actually the standard diplomatic protocol that is followed by every sovereign nation around the world that is seeking to build international relations. The deliberate mischaracterization reveals El Mundo's true calculated attempt to undermine the legitimate diplomatic processes which involve the indigenous nations like Kailasa. Your reportings fail to acknowledge that the same indigenous communities have been historically pressured, manipulated, exploited by powerful economic and political interests within Bolivia. Yet, El Mundo shows absolutely no interest in investigating any of these systematic patterns of exploitation. Moreover, El Mundo completely ignores the defamatory treatment of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism in your reporting. In conclusion, we demand a sincere apology for the blatant inaccuracies that are represented in your articles and publication. A correction or clarification acknowledging the false information and providing the accurate details about Kailasa is imperative to rectify the harm that you have caused. More than 5 major corporate houses such as the Washington Post, MSN, The Week, Outlook Magazine, Dilamalar, and Sixth Italy have removed their Hindu-phobic and defamatory articles that carried similar disinformation against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and Kailasa. We expect El Mundo to follow suit and rectify the harm that you have caused through your irresponsible reporting. Your role as a responsible media entity obliges you to act in the public interest and uphold journalistic integrity. We anticipate your prompt cooperation in setting the record straight and in doing so, ceasing the perpetual continuation of the harmful narratives that are being spread by you against the indigenous community. We are open for further discussion and to provide additional information to facilitate accurate reporting. The question now is whether El Mundo will choose the path of journalistic integrity or continue to participate in the systematic persecution of the indigenous communities and the indigenous Hindu communities. The world is watching, the history will judge, truth will prevail. Thank you for your immediate attention to the matter. We expect a resolute and corrective response. Thank you, Nityanandam.